to the waterways in which we're lucky enough to farm.
We are with 14,000 dairy farmers in the Netherlands in the backyard of 18 million people. So we have to really listen to the society. So it's about phosphor problems, about nitrogen, but also animal welfare. Several topics are important in our country.
But how impactful are these regulations, particularly around phosphates, on Dutch farmers?
No, maybe they were big, but I think at this present moment we already solved them. And because it was all about the balance on soil level and for what you put in and what you take out.
So we would like to take this extracted phosphorus product and concentrate that either into a liquid or into a solid, depending on what the farmer would require. Okay. And we would like to take this liquid product and concentrate the nitrogen within that to make a really concentrated nitrogen liquid product. The resulting product that we would have is just water left over from slurry.
The problem relates to the air quality and what's called the fine particulate material that you can get within the air. And what that does is it causes sort of lung irritation and has been associated with reducing life expectancies. So reducing that fine particulate material has become really quite important. But one of the major contributors towards these fine particulate material is ammonia. And agriculture contributes about 88% of the ammonia release within the UK.
The challenges that face us day in, day out. But it's all too easy to lose track of what's coming across the horizon, lose sight of what's coming our way. With that in mind, we've done some horizon scanning. We've been looking at phosphates and ammonia and how dairy farmers can protect air and water quality. Tonight, we'll be talking about ammonia, looking at the research that's taken place here in the UK and looking abroad to see how they've dealt with the challenge. If you're watching live, then you can ask your questions by scanning the QR code or going to polev.com/AHDB. We've got a fantastic panel with a wide and varied experience within agriculture with us for tonight. If you'd like to introduce yourself, please, John.
Hi, good evening, Tom and everybody else. Welcome to Huntington North Farm. We're hosting tonight and we're actually upstairs in the milk vending, the new milk vending area that was started only 15 months ago. So we are about 900 cows, high-yielding cows, house system. Literally just 2 miles from Chester, there's about 65,000 people 2 miles away. So we enjoy their custom through the milk vending and visiting what we do here on farm, and they can have a look at how the milk is collected and processed and get a bit of an angle, more of an angle on where their food comes from, which is the sort of the story we're trying to tell, to get people more involved with natural food.
Thank you. Rachel.
Yeah, Rachael, Head of Environment Technical at AHDB. I'm really excited again that we're here. It's another part of the important environmental jigsaw for our dairy farms here in the UK. I'm always a fan that we can really start to detract and to sort of learn what others are doing elsewhere, especially our sort of relatively close neighbours. And I think it's always really good to have one eye on the future, so we're prepared, so we're armed, and so we start to really see our farming systems as one sort of big interconnecting sort of biological complex system.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul Arnold. I work for Natural England and I'm the air quality lead on the Catchment Sensitive Farming programme. That's a DEFRA funded programme which has been running since 2006, offering advice to farms on ways to avoid water and air pollution. The air pollution is something we picked, and ammonia particularly is something we picked up in 2019, really as ammonia started to become a more prominent issue and starting to come to the fore. So I'm really interested in being here tonight and to being part of this discussion, because it's easy to see ammonia as a problem, but I also think it represents an opportunity to save resources and use resources more effectively.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Jack?
Evening, Tom. It's great to be here. So my name's Jack Watts, so I am Group Sustainability Lead for the National Farmers Union. So I work closely with our policy teams on environment, so that's anything from SFI through to water quality, our food business unit team, which is all about liaising with the supply chain, and with our climate change team as well. And we spend a lot of time in the big theme of nutrients and managing nutrients. And I think the big opportunity, as I see it, is ensuring that from a regulatory point of view and from a technical point of view, we're looking holistically at all the crop nutrients and all the aspects, whether that's water, whether that's air, whether that's productivity, and making sure that we're holistically looking at all these things and not sort of causing unintended consequences elsewhere in the system.
Thank you very much, Jack. To find out why ammonia is such an important issue for agriculture, my colleague James Haig has been to Harper Adams to discuss the research they've been undertaking on behalf of the dairy industry.
I'm James Haig, Knowledge Exchange Manager with AHDB Dairy, and I've come to Harper Adams to speak to Professor Liam Sinclair about why ammonia is an issue and how dairy farmers can play a role in its reduction.
Liam, there's a lot of recent press and public interest in ammonia release from dairy farms. Is this really the case, and what is the problem?
Well, the problem relates to the air quality and what's called the fine particulate material that you can get within the air, particularly material that's less than 2.5 micrometers, so PM 2.5. So a normal hair on a human head is about 50 to 70 micrometers, so 2.5 is really very small. And what that does is it causes sort of lung irritation and has been associated with reducing life expectancies. So reducing that fine particulate material has become really quite important, and it's part of the reason why we get low emission zones within some cities, and it's why diesel cars have generally gone out of favour. But one of the major contributors towards these fine particulate material is ammonia. And agriculture contributes about 88% of the ammonia release within the UK.
And why the focus particularly on dairy and beef farms?
Well, within agriculture, dairy and beef farms combined make up almost 50% of the ammonia release. So there's been a lot of focus in doing that. Pig and poultry, there was legislation that came in just over 20 years ago, and they have literally cleaned their act up and reduced the output. So now the major focus is on beef and dairy, particularly dairy farms who contribute about 27% of ammonia release. And that ammonia release can come from a variety of reasons. It can come because of the diet and overfeeding protein, but also how we move and store manure. And then the third main area is how we apply that manure and artificial fertiliser onto the ground to avoid this ammonia release.
And AHDB has been funding Harper Adams for some research to conduct and trying to help farmers. And what are the main findings of that research?
Well, what we've been focusing here at Harper Adams is to feed low protein diets. So if there's less protein in the diet, then there will be less urea excreted, because cows don't excrete ammonia. What they excrete is urea. So for a typical cow, maybe giving about 32 kilograms of milk a day, she's eating about 4 kilograms of protein, but there's about 1 kilogram of protein coming out in the milk. So that's about 25% efficient. So the other 75% is then going to go and potentially contribute towards nitrates and NVZs and also ammonia. So the fecal material will be about 30% and about 45% will be coming out in the urine and urea. So what we've been focusing on is to see if we can reduce the protein level, and a typical UK farm would be about 17 to 17.5% protein and get it down to about 15% protein. But we've also been looking at another element in there, and that's to look at forage legumes. Now, forage legumes are higher in protein than grass silage, and their advantage is that you don't need to purchase as much additional feed in to balance the ration. So we've been focusing on red clover and lucerne to be able to get these low protein diets. Now, the difficulty with these forage legumes is that they tend to be the wrong type of protein, what we call too much rumen-degradable protein. And really what we need to be focusing on is not just the crude protein amount, which is what farmers are familiar with, but actually what we call the metabolizable protein. Now, the analogy I would give there is we formulate rations for cows based on metabolizable energy, but feeds have a gross energy, the total energy content. So a kilogram of wheat straw and a kilogram of wheat grains have got approximately the same amount of gross energy, but we know that when we feed cows, that the cow gets a lot more energy from the wheat grains, and the ME content is more than twice the level of the straw. And the same comes with protein as well. Crude protein doesn't really tell us whether we have the right type of protein. We should be focusing for metabolizable protein. So what we've been doing is getting the protein level down from 17.5 to about 15%, but maintaining the same metabolizable protein, and also looking at the amino acid content of that protein, because that becomes more important because cows actually metabolize amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, rather than protein in its entirety. And what we were able to show is that we can get levels down from 17.5 to 15%. We can maintain intake, maintain performance, but we can get the nitrogen use efficiency up from that 25% up to about 35%. And the net effect is that that results in about 60 to 70 grams less of urea being excreted in the urine each day. And to put that in perhaps a more understandable currency, that's about 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare less coming out from the cows that's not going onto the land and contributing towards ammonia release. So that's a big saving. In terms of farm costs, it's also slightly cheaper because you're feeding less protein, which is more expensive, but you need to feed perhaps a higher quality protein to make sure that you supply that metabolizable protein. So there will be a slight saving in cost, but not a massive saving. But you can maintain the performance and reduce the nitrogen and potentially ammonia release from dairy cows.
And go to polev.com/AHDB to submit your questions. Rachel, Liam spoke about the pig and poultry sector having cleaned their act up. What can the dairy sector learn from them?
I think that any sector can actually learn from other sectors. I actually think in agriculture we can also learn from other industries as well. So I think it's really important to not always be reinventing the wheel. And I think it's key in terms of the permitting that already exists for certain sort of pork and poultry farms of a certain size, around intensity. It's really quite key. It's a real focus in terms of those elements. So for me, it's always about having an eye in terms of what can come in terms of regulation. And we already know there have been hints at in terms of England via the Clean Air Strategy, in terms of how or if, when permitting might come in terms for dairy and intensive beef. So I think for us it's about looking in terms of what has happened before, what they've done to combat it, and actually what we need to do now in terms of the tools that we have, and as we've just heard from Liam as well, in terms of what we can do to prevent that happening to our sector as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Jack, should we have greater ambition to drive better yield and quality from homegrown legumes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we look across the portfolio of crops that we grow in the country, our legumes, our pulses, are kind of a bit of a poor relation. And that's kind of by no accident. If we go back and understand where we were from a European policy point of view, those old policy mechanisms really favoured the cereal crops and really kind of left the legumes, pulses out in the cold when it came to supporting development of those crops. And so they're a little bit behind in terms of the incentive to grow those crops. But there's a big prize there in terms of driving yield. And as we saw in the video, there's a big prize in actually driving those efficiency of use by the rumen and by the cow itself. Should be a huge opportunity to do that. That needs an injection of investment and ambition in research. We've got exciting times coming with gene editing. What might that do for our ability to grow more homegrown protein, either for humans or for animal consumption as well. And I think we should have ambition to get behind that, because the more diverse supply of protein we've got, the more ambition we can have in terms of resilience to climate change and changing demands. We know that there is a lot of focus on soy. different sources of soy come with different levels of sustainability criteria, and so there's opportunity to really focus on that.
And John, we were speaking earlier on, you're including a lot more clover in your lays now, so you're altering the protein that you're feeding, but have you looked at the protein across the entire diet? This research has been around for a while in terms of protein reduction.
I think there's a couple of points, just picking up on the last one. You know, the SFI has introduced more legumes, and obviously, sadly, that's no longer available to enter, which hopefully that might be turned around. So we started that last year. So we are certainly growing more clover than we were. Yeah, on the diets, yes, we have dropped protein, mainly on the back of the price of protein, which started in the Ukraine war. We all saw the rises in all feedstuffs, didn't we? So including fertilizer. So it focused your mind very much on your input costs on those areas. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Liam spoke about the human health issues associated with ammonia, but does that extend beyond human health?
It does. I mean, the human health issues which Liam talked about are very important. You know, we all breathe the air. It affects all of us. But it does go beyond that. The fine particulate matter which Liam was talking about, when that's formed from ammonia, effectively the particles are very fine particles of ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate. So when it rains, you've effectively got fertilizer-laden rain coming down, which if it falls on habitats and areas which don't need that nitrogen or can be damaged by it, then that can cause quite serious damage to those habitats. And likewise, ammonia, the gas itself, is also quite damaging to a lot of very sensitive species. So yeah, it's a combination of the ammonia and the particulate matter which can form from it can both have quite serious ecological impacts. But I think the other thing to remember is that ammonia is comprised principally of nitrogen. So if we're losing ammonia into the air, we're losing nitrogen. And you know, that is nitrogen which really should be in the grass or in the crop, helping to sustain the growth and encouraging efficient production of forage. If it's going into the air, it's being lost. You know, a colleague came out with a very nice quotation a couple of weeks ago, just said, pollution is simply a resource which hasn't been used effectively. And I think it's useful to think of ammonia in that context.
That's a brilliant quotation. That brings me on to a question that's coming from the audience. Why should we be concerned about excess protein in the diet, and how can we tell if we've got the protein level in the diet correct? Does anybody want to take that one?
I'll make a start on it. I mean, one, I suppose it comes down to sort of economics. You know, as we already heard, that you know there is the scope to actually sort of perhaps drop proteins without necessarily hitting yield or perhaps more importantly margins. But it also, if you have high levels of protein in excess of what is actually needed for the production, the cow still has to metabolize that excess protein, and that takes energy, and that is energy which effectively could have been produced in milk. So for every time you have to excrete excess protein, effectively that is milk, lost milk. The other aspect is that as the protein is metabolized, it's sort of transported in the form of urea around the bloodstream, and that can have an effect on the pH of the uterus, and that can then have a knock-on effect on fertility as well.
I think just to add to that, lowering your protein levels will lower your carbon footprint. And obviously, you know, it's very in vogue to be lowering carbon footprint, so it's a positive story all round, really.
It's exactly what. That's all I can think of. It's multiple wins, and it's about the lower carbon footprint. It's also in terms of perhaps what you can do for biodiversity as well. If you're integrating legumes in your system, you're delivering more. So I think it's about the multiple wins in terms of carbon, economics, animal health, plus also the natural environment that you're operating in. So I think there's some real positives on what perhaps feels quite different, I think, in the first instance. I
think just on the point there, though, I'm a little bit cautious on not losing output. There's definitely got to be the balanced approach. I'm not a nutritionist, but that would be a question for those guys to take up with before we all get too excited on dropping protein down to whatever the too low percentage is.
Yes, I think you did ask a second part of the question there about sort of how you know or can gauge whether the protein's like. Usually the milk buyers will supply you with information on your milk ureas, and that's a good guide as to whether the protein levels are right. I mean, as a rough guide, I think sort of 200 to 300 milligrams per litre is what I say is a rough indicator of where it should be. But the important thing to say, you need professional advice to interpret that. And just picking up on sort of John's point about not wanting to hit yield, you can get this information, but being able to interpret it and use it correctly is absolutely critical. There can be other things which cause the milk ureas to go outside of that, but you need to know that, and you need somebody who is professional and can guide you. And if necessary, do it in little steps, see what happens. I think the figures which were talked about by Liam are probably sort of that's something where we can perhaps get to, but we're not going to do it in one huge step. Let's take little steps.
John, have you started along this journey of reducing overall dietary protein?
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, predominantly it was cost, and after being in Holland, they've obviously brought their protein down a tremendous amount. I think we were looking at figures of 50% less ammonia. Now, whether where I'm not quite sure where we are on the track. We don't actually measure it in the UK per se like they do in Holland, do they? That possibly, I don't know, that could be a way forward.
Absolutely. How can we measure ammonia levels on farm?
I think that is very difficult. Partly, I mean, ammonia as a gas is something which is very tricky just because of its chemical nature. But I think, of course, ammonia comes from a range of sources on the farm. It can be very difficult. It's not like you can just sort of put a measurement in one place and say, okay, yeah, that's what it is. Some will be coming from the slurry store, the housing, spreading, etc. And also, I think you have to remember that we're talking about the air. It doesn't stick within catchments like water does. It moves. It's influenced by happens elsewhere. So it is very difficult. I mean, you can use aerial imagery. I think quite a lot of that has been developed, satellites and drones, etc., which can give you a good indication. But I think we're still a long way off being able to be in a situation where we can sort of put a sensor on a farm and say the ammonia level on this farm is this. I think what you need to look at are the practices and sort of think, well, okay, that's a practice which possibly there's scope for improvement there. We can move that. But looking, and I think, as Rachael was talking about, looking at the farm as a whole, not necessarily just picking little bits out and saying, right, we'll change that, because I think you've got to think, what's the knock-on impact of that? It is, that's right, yes. That's really important to think about.
Can farmers be better supported to improve protein utilisation and reduce ammonia emissions?
I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think we've touched on the need for that nutritional science to really focus into it. I was quite intrigued by that video we talked about when I was at university a long time ago, doing basic animal nutrition. You were focused on crude protein, but actually what's important is actually how is the rumen and the animal utilising that protein to the I can't say it, the metabolizeable protein. And I think we need, I think that there's a need to drive that science of actually, okay, if I've got a red clover silage, how well is the cow going to utilise that versus a soy versus a rape meal, and really driving that and driving that into the professional development of advisors and farmers as well, because to really focus on that, because it is a precious resource. Protein's an expensive thing. It's energy intensive to make. And it's really important that we do that, and understanding that science, understanding how rumens are reacting, and all of the different moving parts. So I think it's an exciting area, but undoubtedly, farmers need to be better supported to make the use of the current science, but then help steer, well, where are the knowledge gaps, where are the research gaps, to then make those further steps over the coming years.
Yeah, I think that's the key, and it's that translation again from research to farm. And I think sometimes we're not great at doing that, perhaps in the UK, in terms of what does that mean for your average dairy farmer? What does that look like in practice? And actually, who can translate that advice for them? So I think it's a real fundamental step.
Yes. And I think it's important as well to use peer-to-peer learning. If there are some people who have tried it and been successful, being able to use those as exemplars to others, because I think one of the things we find, certainly through catchment sensitive farming, is the thing which speaks most loudly to farmers if you want to change practice is another farmer who's done it, that farmers will believe other farmers who've been successful.
Yeah, absolutely, and in that respect, in the Netherlands, the dairy farmers have been working under enhanced environmental legislation for a number of years. As a dairy-dense, highly populated country, working in harmony with the non-farming population has always been prioritised. This includes protecting water quality. So what better place to investigate the reduction in ammonia emissions? John and a delegation of farmers went on a fact-finding mission to find out more.
Strict environmental regulations in the Netherlands have shaped the dairy industry. To find out how ammonia has been reduced and the impact this has had on farming practices, we sent a group of UK dairy farmers to investigate.
My name is Zwier van der Vegte. I was the farm manager here for more than 20 years. And now I'm a project manager and I'm doing especially extension. So I work a lot with farmers and find out with them how they can go on and what kind of things are important. But first about the market itself. And we're part of the Wageningen University, so Paul and we are colleagues. And this is a location where we especially look into sustainable dairy farming and all the issues. So an integrated approach, that's our topic. And not only phosphorus and ammoniac, but also animal welfare, greenhouse gases, nature development and so on. So it's very important to do them all together. And also Andre is very active with it, regenerative agriculture, and so working on all these issues together to have a sustainable future.
John Allwood and Zwier van der Vegte discussed the research undertaken at De Marke and the changes made by the industry in the Netherlands.
I'll start with the appearing of ammonia. And we got three things. It's feeding the cow, and it's the stable type, so the flooring and so on, and it's the applying of manure. So we've got three parts where ammonia volatilization is the issue. And it starts with feeding. So for feeding it's very important to bring down the nitrogen who's in the feedstuff. When the lower the nitrogen, the lower the ammoniac emission. That's where it starts. And then the droppings and the urine comes on the floor, and that's a big issue, is to separate droppings and urine. And that's also what's happening here. And so there's a closed floor with little small holes so the urine can flow off, and the droppings come on the floor, and the scraper goes every hour and brings the manure in a closed storage as quickly as possible. So within an hour urine and the droppings are in the closed storage, so there will be ammonia coming up but not coming out.
You dropped your protein.
Yeah.
And you've got a low emissions floor. Can you give us some figures on the overall reduction in the ammonia from where it was to what it is today?
What we measure with the system.
Yep.
And so the total package, what we are doing is bringing down the crude protein, is having a closed floor, is bringing water on that floor. Then our reduction is nearly 60%. And the status of this floor, and Paul managed it this morning. Normally a slatted floor is 13 kg ammonia per cow per year. This floor has an indication of 11.8, and in reality we are producing 5. So the ammoniac emission now is 5 kg per cow per year instead of 13.
So you dropped over 50%.
It's more than 60. Tomorrow we are bringing out slurry, and we do it by tube. So there's a pump on the place here, and it's pumping the slurry to the field, and there's a slit injector who is bringing it in the sod. That's very important, so that the surface is as small as possible, because the surface is very important for the amount of ammonia who will appear to the air.
And you only shallow inject with a disc in Holland. You don't have any other system for applying slurry.
Yeah, on other types of soil we got, and on clay soil and peat soil, they can put it on top of the soil.
Yep.
They can't spread it wide out. That's forbidden in whole Holland.
Yep.
But they don't have to put it in the sod. But on sandy soil, where we are here, we have to put it in the sod.
So it's soil dependent on the system you use, really.
And the soil type you are, and so on. Yeah.
Out of all the things that you've looked at, the 4 things you've looked at, which has given you the best return for reducing your ammonia?
Yeah, I think feeding, and maybe I'll say it because everyone can do it. Huh? It is not depending on the style type you are and which stable you got. So feeding, everyone can do it, and everyone can bring down the intake of protein and bring down that ammonia. And I think that's also the biggest part of it.
So thanks, Zwier. Thanks for showing us around. It's been very informative.
Yeah, nice to have you.
John Allwood spoke to Andre de Groot about the adaptations he's made on his farm to remain compliant with the ammonia regulations and the impact that's had on his business.
So, good morning, Andre.
Good morning.
We've come over from the UK to have a look at your farm in the Netherlands with a reflection on phosphate and ammonia, and I've been tasked with fact-finding about the ammonia story. So on this farm you produce how many cubic of slurry? How many cubes?
2,500.
And how much of that can you spread on your land?
2,500.
You can spread the whole lot, you don't have to export any?
We have not problems here. We have about 120 cows, 17 young cows on 90 hectares.
Okay. So if you want to expand your milk production
we have about
with more cows?
We have 8,000 litres of milk per cow.
Okay.
With 480 and for 3.75 protein.
Yeah.
And
so if you wanted to increase the yield to 10,000 kilos, is that a problem?
No problem.
So tell me about the ammonia problem that you've had.
I have not so many ammonia problem, but I try to not so much protein in the feed.
Okay.
Yeah. Then you have also not so much manure production.
So can you tell me what your protein level was historically and what you've come down to now?
170 to 180.
17%, 18%.
80%.
Yeah.
Now we are about 5 years, 40 to 50%.
15%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And your milk production has remained the same level.
No, the milk production is coming from 9,000, 9,500, now 8.
So it's dropped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we have not so many costen.
Yeah, less cost.
Yeah.
Yeah, because protein is expensive. So do you use any artificial fertilizer on this farm, or is it all slurry?
First, we build some with fertilizer, but it is made from manure.
Made from manure?
Yeah. That's the from company. They have relations to make manure to from manure renewal. We make.
Are we talking urea here?
No, renewal is recovered nitrogen from manure.
Yeah.
So there's a system that you can recover the nitrogen from the manure.
Some factories they have relation to the government to make that.
You're going to have your own.
Yeah.
What's the cost on that? What's the cost to build that?
250,000 euros.
So how long would that take to pay back on this farm on 120 cows?
Very, very long, but I have lots of subsidies.
You've got subsidies to do that?
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
Almost no...
So it doesn't stand on its own 2 feet,
yeah.
The 250,000 euros?
Yeah.
No. Okay. What things have you done on this farm to stop the ammonia leaving the farm through the atmosphere? I see you've got a covered slurry store there. Have you got anything in the sheds, modern technology, to minimise the loss of the ammonia out of the slurry?
Last year we have putting water to the manure. Then you have not so much field emissions. We bring the mist in the ground with the installation in our driving. You have not so much field emission. In the stall we going with new open floor. When we make this year, next month, we make the floor closed with rubber. Then going to the collector, we bring the mist outside, and we go making a renewer, and we can 70–80% reduction of ammonium.
So, the government have obviously got a lot of regulation on you.
Yeah.
If they said you just do what you want, yeah, as a farmer, would you change anything, or is this enhanced your business?
No, I do not. I change nothing.
You change nothing?
No.
No. Generally, it's all good practice.
Yeah.
Because you said if the rules weren't there, you'd still do what you're doing now. So that's really comforting, I think, for the guys that have come out to see you. Thanks very much.
To find out about the future direction of dairy farming in the Netherlands, John spoke to Paul Galama from Wageningen University Research.
Great to see you.
Yep.
Fantastic research station you've got here. We've seen a commercial farm this morning.
Yep.
So just give us a resume on the ammonia side of things here. Tell us a bit about what you do here and where you see the future going for the Dutch dairy farmer.
Yeah. Well, I work for sustainable dairy systems as a researcher, and we talked today about less protein in the diet to reduce ammonia emission. So I am project leader of a group of 150 farmers and 45 advisors to reduce it. The average in the Netherlands was 165 crude protein in the diet. It was in 2023. Last year we don't know yet, but and this group of 150 farmers are around 155, 158 on average. So if you feed more maize, it's easier, but the farmers with more grazing, more grassland and other peat soils, it's a bit more difficult. So I work on feeding, I'm working on housing systems, but I think to the future we should look at an integrated solutions and also goal-oriented. So we talked about the Enka tool that measures the input and output on the animals and on the field. So if you have a goal, and the idea is to give maximum flexibility to the farmers how to do it. Because now the regulation is a lot on how to do it. This type of floor or this or that. But if you could give more flexibility, and you could say that the nitrogen surplus per hectare, this is the goal, and you have to reach it one way or the other way.
If that improves the profitability of the farm, it's a definite goer. Yeah, I think that's what it has to show.
Yeah, if better management also pays off for better environment, that should be the plus.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thank you. Yeah.
/AHDB. John, what were your take-home messages from the Netherlands?
Obviously, I was quite amazed at how they'd been on their journey and dropped their emissions by quite a considerable amount over the years. I think one of the things that there was an abbreviation, and I can't quite remember it, Tom. I'm sure you'll recite it to me.
Thank you very much for that, because as you know, I did forget that last week. So it's the annual nutrient cycling assessment tool.
Well done, Tom. I'm very impressed. Which was obviously measuring everything to the farm and everything out and balancing it up. Government regulated, I think, or government approved or whatever, which I'm not sure how that fits with farmers generally, but it enhanced their profitability, which was one of the key take-home messages that I took from that. Yeah.
Perfect. And they also spoke about something which was pretty new to us, and it confused us during the day. So a product called Renew. Can you remember what that was?
That's a European initiative, government initiative about.
So it's recovered nitrogen from manure.
Yeah, you're much better at those sort of things than me, Tom. You're much more intelligent. Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, I don't know whether. How do we relate that back to the anchor system? Was it involved in that?
Everything's measured in, everything's measured out. So yes, it is. But
yeah.
it in effect creates an artificial nitrogen product which has similar properties to bagged fert.
That's right. Yeah. So there's obviously a financial angle in that.
Perfect. Paul, we saw in the video about low emission floors, regular scraping, reduced emissions. What benefits beyond ammonia does that have?
Well, besides actually reducing the emissions per se from the house, actually having lower ammonia levels within the house has knock-on benefits for the animal. I mean, it's not particularly pleasant for the cow being in a house having to breathe an atmosphere which has a lot of ammonia in, and similarly for the people who are working in there with the animals as well. It makes that a lot more pleasant and a safer environment for them. But one of the other benefits is when you've got that regular scraping, keeping the floor clean, are the improvements you get in foot health as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Jack, from a supply chain point of view, how far up the agenda is this beyond farm gate?
Yes, it's an interesting one. So last week we were talking about water quality, and we know that that is really high up the agenda for consumer-facing brands and so supply chains. I would say this one is probably not as high on the agenda. It's probably less understood, but because it kind of fits into kind of an environmental challenge area, it will be on the agenda, and undoubtedly it will be rising up the agenda. And I think that sort of lays down the challenge to the industry to say, okay, we know this is coming, we know it's on the agenda, we know it's going to get more focus because we know that brands in the supply chain are having an ever-increasing focus on sustainability, environmental outcomes. So don't be surprised if this continues to rise up the agenda.
Can I have a question on that? What sort of timescale do you realistically think that could be?
Oof, that's a really, really good but a really challenging question, I think, and because it's part of a mix of issues, whether that's from a carbon point of view, water quality we know is really high on the agenda, but delivering for what customers want to buy as well. So we're coming through a cost of living crisis. We know food price inflation is still a thing. We know consumers are challenged. We know so, and that creates a real challenge for a retailer saying, actually, how do I kind of create that offer, demonstrate credentials of what's going on? So I don't think there's it's very difficult to put sort of a definitive point on that.
Well, what I was going to say, there's obviously a cost to doing all this, isn't there? And are we able to pass that cost on? Yeah. We usually fail to do that, so we need some strength behind that to actually show what we're doing, and we want a return on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think this is the classic thing we kind of for agriculture is, okay, we're selling mainly into commodity markets, which are driven by global forces, and the supply chain is horrendously competitive. Everyone wants to drive market share, but then we're kind of saying, okay, well, we want to see these kind of great environmental and sustainability outcomes, and so that's a circle that is everly challenging to square. I think for dairy it's a really interesting one because if we look around the world, you're seeing ever increasing environmental regulation, which to my mind, I think it's fascinating that there should be some analysis there. Well, what's the impact having that on the global supply base? Because you can't really go to a major dairy producing, exporting region around the world where there isn't environmental regulation starting to have an impact. So I think there's a big question of actually what's happening around the world and what's that mean for the marketplace.
I suppose just to add on as well, it's always interesting for me is what's driving it. Is it supply chain or is it regulation or is it industry? And I think with this, I mean, it's quite complex with air quality because it's governed by, sort of retained EU law, international conventions, UK law, regulations across the devolved. So it's quite bitty.
Yes.
But actually, it does feel like it's pacing up. It's being integrated in some of our sort of post-cap schemes now as well. So I think it's interesting whether it will come, regulation might come before those supply chain drivers, I think, possibly in air quality.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's certainly the regulatory targets are sort of the thing that are in the focus of how do we deal with this.
Rachel, you hinted at devolves then. Are any of the devolved nations further ahead or further behind? Do they look any different at all?
I think probably England are slightly further ahead, or were. I think we're probably a little bit impasse at the moment while we wait for the updated environmental improvement plan in terms of what that looks like and air quality. I know certainly both Wales and Scotland have had quite strong guidance in terms of sort of best practice around air quality for a number of years. I know Wales now are looking at how they integrate it in the new sustainable farming scheme in the future. So I think, a bit like Jack says, the pressure's ramping up now. People are much more aware in terms of the targets, the commitments in terms of improving air quality, particularly around ammonia, and obviously they've got one eye on the fact that, you know, we've already heard from the videos of actually the proportion of ammonia that comes from agriculture. So it is ramping up, and I think for me it's always about us taking control, I think, as an industry, and actually let's demonstrate what we can do before the regulation comes down hard and it becomes law, because that's what we don't want.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've heard about low emission housing, slurry application, low protein feeding. Are there any nature-based solutions that we should bear in mind?
Absolutely, and I'm a fan of multiple sort of wins, and I think when we can get win-win situations across our farm, and it goes back to the point about seeing our farm as whole entities and how it interacts. So actually a real quick easy win is tree planting around sort of stores, you know, slurry stores. It's a really key win if you can be quite strategic in terms of perhaps there could be other benefits in terms of perhaps limiting sort of soil erosion, depending where those the stores are, looking at sort of water management, looking at shade on tracks perhaps as well, or collecting yards. So I think you can be quite clever with it. Obviously you've got to think about other impacts in terms of tree planting, but I think there are some really useful tools out there that you can really sort of use nature to start some of those sort of wins as well.
Great. Dutch farmers we interviewed all had a can-do attitude in their management approach. Do you see such an attitude change happening in the UK? Happy for anybody to take that.
I think so. As I say, you know, we in CSF worked on water from 2006, and we brought air quality from 2019, and we do see more awareness from people who are coming to talk to us and asking for advice of the need to think about ammonia emissions as well as water, and it's I think that awareness does grow. And I think part of it is sort of repeating the message, sort of the drip sort of effect. If it's said enough times, more and more people listen. But I think it's also, besides just seeing air quality as an issue, I think it's time to see the linkage between water and air. And you know, it's something I quite often say that it's not always useful to segregate water and air. If we're talking about ammonia, we're talking about nitrogen. And you know, exactly the same as if you talk about nitrate loss to water. It's the same thing, and a lot of the things you can do for one have an effect for the other. So I think we are seeing much more awareness, and I think more understanding of that, looking at nutrients in the round rather than trying to segregate things and tackle little individual issues.
I think that's really important, particularly when we're focusing on air quality. I think one of the frustrating things dealing with from a regulation point of view is that they might right, we're going to focus on, the regulation is on hitting this target on air quality, and we're going to focus on that, and then we forget all the other stuff around it. And there's a real challenge and a risk that we end up doing is either pollution swapping, issue swapping, or exporting the problem. And I think we have to kind of hold ourselves to account and hold regulators to account of actually that's not going to solve the problem. And so we saw it with the urea regulations, or the threat of hard regulation on urea fertiliser, which was at risk of completely banning access to untreated urea. All that would have done is actually, instead of farmers using urea in the early growing season, they were going to swap that out to use more ammonium nitrate. Wasn't really going to have an impact on ammonia emissions, but what it was going to do was actually going to up the risk of leaching because we know that urea is a better product to be using. So we're at risk of swapping those issues. Why the focus on home-grown protein is really important, because we know that there are challenges with soy. And then, okay, well, we can have higher quality protein. Okay, well, let's feed more soy. Well, that's might be solving the protein quality problem, but we're just swapping that for another issue. So we need that real holistic focus on nutrient management, and we just don't get it with regulation, because regulation will just get so blinkered on one particular issue. It's not good at joining stuff up.
I couldn't agree more, and I was thinking also need to translate that into sort of capital grants would be a prime example. So again, use the example in terms of water and air pollutants. This has been a bugbear for a long time for me. The fact that we will have capital grants for increasing slurry capacity, but not insist on covering at the same time necessarily. And actually, it's a really easy win to start looking at air and water pollutants together on a farm rather than just one, because otherwise it's a massive cost in terms of retrofitting or building a cover over an existing store. So I'm a big fan that it filtrates not only in regulation, but also grant schemes, policies, and I think other sort of generalised schemes that affect farms.
And I think it's important as well that, you know, we look at the farm as a whole, think what's going to work on this farm. You know, we don't go in with a one-size-fits-all solution and sort of saying, if everybody does that, that's the answer. Yeah, it'll be part of the answer, but for some people it won't work, but they might be able to do exactly the same thing in a different way. And if that's what works for them, that's what we should be looking at.
Yeah, I think as well, I think there needs to be an open-minded approach on that. I totally agree with what you're saying. That would help on one rule. It needs to be, a sensible approach. You know, going back to, it will cost a lot of money to fix this problem. A huge amount of money. It's quite scary.
Do we need to look harder at fertiliser use as another way of reducing ammonia?
Yeah, I mean it's part of the story, and the nitrogen fertiliser market. I don't need to tell farmers what's happened in the last few years with nitrogen prices, because it's been a horrendous moment, and we've come through that, and it's a precious resource. The fertiliser market is changing. We're moving away from some of the traditional products because we're getting fertiliser from other parts of the world, different products, different sources of nitrogen. They come with different knowledge needs, and so we should always be striving to improve and understand the science, and particularly how different soils. Last week I was really fascinated with the discussion. We were talking about clays and chalks and the interaction of phosphates, and so it's getting that tailored approach to the individual farm, rather than sort of relying on necessarily a blanket approach. RB209 is a great tool we can use, but I sometimes get the impression that we're kind of trying to blanket it too much, and it can't be tailored advice and knowledge in a particular farm circumstance. So we should always strive to get better, for sure.
I think what's interesting as well, I mean, this goes back to what you were looking at last week, the Harper video where actually extracting phosphorus and nitrogen from the slurry. And I think saw it a bit in what you were talking about in the Netherlands. Actually, instead of having the slurry as a product where you perhaps don't necessarily know what the content of it is, you can't control the content, so basically you've got to apply what you've got. But actually the use of that technology to actually turn that into a product which you can actually tailor to the need, I think is a huge step forward, a real area which I think we'd like to see.
Yeah. Go back to the Ukraine war, £1,000 a tonne. You seriously looked at what nutrients you'd got in the slurry store, because they were really, really valuable. And I think that's slipped back into the old ways with fertiliser. I don't know, was it $3.50, something like that at the moment? Yeah, it's a third of the price of what it was. And there's a temptation not to look back at your natural resource and use that accordingly.
And that's the key, isn't it? And I think probably a few of us who've said the same thing. It's looking at your farm as a whole. It's looking about actually what it delivers naturally and how you can utilise it, how you can harness it. But actually, ultimately, it makes you more resilient, doesn't it? Economically, but also with availability when these things aren't available. But actually, if you're utilising what you've already got, again, it's another sort of win-win situation.
Why is it important to consider the entire slurry journey to maximise the reduction of ammonia emissions?
Shall I take that one? We'll start off on
yes, please.
Okay, I think it's important because, I mean, if you put steps in place like we saw the low emission flooring and the scraping, so you're stopping the ammonia loss in the housing, which then means the slurry has a higher nitrogen content. And if you then put other steps in place like covering the store, you're stopping the loss there. So what you end up at spreading is a higher nitrogen content slurry, but then if you then apply it with, say, a vacuum tanker on a warm breezy day, all that ammonia and nitrogen you've saved is going to get lost at the end. So really you have to think through each stage. If we're saving the nitrogen here, how are we going to make sure we don't lose it elsewhere? So you can put all those steps in place. But I think critically, as we saw in the video from the Netherlands, that low emission spreading using the trailing shoe or the injection, I think is a critical step at the end to make sure that what you've saved earlier on, you don't just lose at the end of the process.
Probably goes back to what John said as well about understanding the nutrients you already have on farms, and I think that's the key, isn't it? Yes. I think it's important also to think about some of the negative impacts, such as the impact of ammonia as well. But actually, if you see it as a valuable resource, you probably manage it a bit better, don't you? I think, because you don't want to lose it. So I think it goes back to that mindset shift, perhaps, in terms of the value in that and managing it, that you don't lose it.
So, if we were able to look into the future, what does the regulatory landscape across the UK look like?
Already touched on, I honestly think probably we will see sort of binding targets that are much more probably legislative, I think, going forward. I think at the moment we've got targets that I think in terms of they're not so strict in terms of industry, but I think on the horizon it's likely to get much tougher on this.
I think I'd say that yes, we've got a challenge and we know that, but in terms of the future regulatory landscape, I would like to see it not change because we've taken all the steps we need to address the problem beforehand. I mean, we've seen in the last couple of weeks the videos from the Netherlands of what happens when you get into that problem. Regulation catches you, and as we touched on earlier, regulation can be quite blunt. Yeah. And I would, if we had no more regulation on aircraft, that would be great. If that means what we've done is we actually, we've looked at farm businesses individually, what's going to work here, and we've actually addressed the solution as an industry and not got into the position that the Netherlands or Denmark have got into.
Yeah. I think that's right. Certainly the advice-led approach towards compliance is really, really important to maintain. And we've got to make efforts to avoid the hard regulation because that's blunt. And as I said before, it can get too focused on single issue outcomes rather than the overall nutrient outcomes. I think that what we kind of have to bear in mind is, as you alluded to earlier, John, is just the sheer amount of cost that this stuff involves. For any one farm, it can be hundreds of thousands of pounds to get this stuff in place. And at the moment, we know confidence is a real challenge because of just the situation that the industry is in, and that needs to be recognised. It needs to be recognised that we're dealing with commodity markets here at the end of the day that are quite unforgiving and don't always allow the farm to get a return on investment for investing in that. And so the policy involvement is really useful in doing that, in sort of enabling farmers to keep producing in a backdrop of compliance demands and to give that confidence to be able to supply the market with what the market wants.
Yeah, I hope you're right because water bills are going to go up between 22 and 28% next week. I'd love to be able to put my price up by 22 or 28% and pay for all the stuff that you've just explained. Yeah. And I am still struggling as to how we're going to get from A to B.
Yeah.
I really am, yeah.
I think that's a really good point because from a water quality perspective, we often see that contrast between what's happening in the water industry, what's happening in the farming industry. A water company can apply to the regulator, say, right, Mr. Regulator, I want to invest in all this extra stuff. Please, can I put the price up? Yeah, go for it. Mm. If only farmers had the luxury to be able to say, I need this to be able to do that. And that's, in my mind, some economists might disagree, but that's a form of market failure in my book. And actually, that's where there's a role for government, because to help keep production onshore, to help society have sight of how we're producing milk to some of the highest regulations in the world. and which is important, but we need to bear in mind that we are in an incredibly competitive global marketplace, and so presents a real challenge.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everybody. There really was so much to discuss tonight, but unfortunately we're up against time, so apologies if we didn't get through to your question. What I'd really like from you is just one take-home message for the viewers at home. John, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think from what we saw in Holland, it was very positive. Don't become negative about some of the stuff that's been discussed tonight. You know, we will find a way. We will find a way through. We will conquer it, and we will be better for it. That's my message.
Rachel?
I'm like a bit of a broken record, I think, really. But for me, it's about looking at your farm as a whole, and also then looking for that low-hanging fruit, the win-wins, the things that really work for your farming system.
I think I'd return to that quotation from my colleague earlier on, that pollution is simply a resource which hasn't been used effectively, and just remember that tackling if you stop ammonia loss, you're stopping nitrogen and money leaving the farm.
It's a good quotation. Thank you.
I think for me, Tom, I think it's I can't forget that number of that 25% efficiency from the feed through to the milk, and I think we should become quite focused on that and not apologise for becoming obsessed from a technical point of view, and demand, well, what do we need from the research community? There's different sources of protein, and really that the cow is a magnificent beast because we have that rumen, we have the fermentation, we have the animal, and how do we kind of have that unhealthy obsession with driving that efficiency and ask those questions that we need answering.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to all our contributors from the Netherlands and from the UK, to our panellists, John, Paul, Rachel and Jack. Thank you very much for watching at home and sending in those questions too. If you've pre-registered, then we'll send you a resource pack for further reading. We'll also send you a feedback form, and we would really value some feedback. This is the second time that we've tried one of these live streams, so I'm dead keen to hear what you think about it. If you're watching on Catch-Up, then please leave a comment so we can see your feedback there. If you're watching on Catch-Up, then please search on the AHDB website in the search bar for ammonia, and you should have access to the reading there. And again, if you missed out on the episode last week, then please visit the AHDB YouTube site. Like, subscribe, it only helps to build the channel. Thank you very much, and good night.